are talking The Haunting of the Queen Mary, also known as simply The Queen Mary. Now this is directed and co-written by Gary Shaw, who you may know as the director of the movie Dracula Untold. And this movie stars Alice Eve, and it's quite a lavish production in many ways, and was actually filmed upon the Queen Mary. Now, if you're not familiar with the Queen Mary, it is not a local kind of British pub. It's actually a cruise liner that operated for around 30 years between the 1930s and the 1960s. It's now currently permanently moored off the coast of California, and it's kind of a tourist attraction. Now, there have been many rumours about ghostly goings on within the kind of the confines of the Queen Mary. In fact, it was voted one of the 10 most haunted places in the world on one particular kind of chart. So, what is the story all about? Well, this movie actually has two timelines. It has a timeline in the 30s, when it's kind of operating as a kind of cruise liner at that point, and a kind of modern timeline. Now we kind of get about equal kind of screen time for each. So in the kind of the 30s timeline, we have a family sort of going on this kind of cruise liner, and they're a bit of a grifters. They kind of blag their way into things and stuff like that. And they are trying to find essentially stardom for their young daughter, who is a great tap dancer, entertainer, and you get a variety of celebrities who go on this cruise liner, and they're hoping to get their daughter kind of discovered and things like this. And on the kind of the modern storyline, we actually have Alice Eve's character, who her son, her young son, and her like estranged husband, I think, are wanting to go onto the now kind of retired cruise liner, do a book, and kind of took the owners into doing like so they could kind of map it out in a virtual reality style rides type thing, kind of like scan it in and things like this. Now, in both of these timelines, there seems to be some type of let's call it supernatural occurrences happen, and the storyline in the past, in the 1930s, then informs the storyline in modern times, as we have essentially a ripple up effect from what's happened in the 1930s affects this kind of the more modern timeline as well. And they both kind of run in edited concurrently, so it flicks back between both timelines. Now, what will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what we think of The Queen Mary. Now, this certainly isn't a kind of cheapo, low-budget B-movie. It's actually a quite impressively filmed and lavish production in many ways, maybe without kind of being to the extremes of like a blockbuster kind of budget here, but it feels like this movie has a strong production value and really does benefit, I feel, from being, as I believe, partially filmed at least on the actual kind of Queen Mary. The kind of the location shooting is impressive. There are obviously some kind of sets here, but it looks fabulous. This movie looks very, very lavish, I have to say. It really has that flavour of the world as it was kind of back in the in the 30s and things like that. So it really has a fantastic production design here that we kind of see on screen. And the other thing I would say as well is the director, who, as I mentioned, previously directed Dracula Untold. He's certainly, I feel like he's let off the leash a little bit. Gary Shaw here definitely has a more of an artistic style compared to maybe the likes of Dracula Untold. I feel here he's left more to his own kind of artistic expression. It reminds me a little bit of kind of a similar style to maybe Edgar Wright, is the best way to describe it. For example, we'll have these lots of kind of close-up shots of kind of like, for example, you'll see a key going through a lock hole, very kind of close-up to turning. You'll see the latch go, kind of the door handle, all kind of edited, so you see very kind of quick cuts and kind of like things at extreme close-ups and stuff like that. We get lots of kind of like false perspective and kind of close-ups and things. So he definitely has more of an artistic expression in this movie, I feel, than for example, Dracula Untold. So, there's certainly an artistic quality to the movie. It almost dips its toe into being somewhat of a kind of an art house horror to some degree, but it actually has a relatively kind of gory effects as well in it. There's not loads of like overt horror, I would say, but when we do see, scenes of horror, of violence, they're punctuated through the movie relatively infrequently, so when they do happen, I feel like it hits pretty well. So we get a couple of sequences where we see people dying on screen without kind of spoiling anything here, and it's quite brutal. What we see on screen is depicted in quite a brutal fashion, quite shocking in many ways, and I feel is quite effective. There are also some sequences I feel where we see the supernatural kind of side of stuff in more of an overt fashion, and there are a couple of times where I feel it works in a very effective. Particularly one scene where Alice Eve is looking at her phone. Is all the only thing I would say. There's a pretty well put together kind of sequence with that one. On a technical level, this movie is, as I've mentioned, very professional, but not just in the direction. Everything from like the sound design, the soundtrack, I think is pretty good. The editing is interesting. We'll come on to that, but it's not badly edited, so to speak. But I feel it's maybe over edited. But it's certainly gives it a stylistic edge, I would suppose. The fact that we have two timelines gives you a sort of variety on screen. We have this ship in its glory days with the kind of everything looking pristine, everyone in their costumes and things like that. It's kind of the time. Then we have its more kind of like dilapidated state in its kind of modern era. So fans who like a kind of a period horror, fans who like a kind of more of a lavish and elaborate kind of like horror movie, a slightly elevated horror movie perhaps, I think may would check this one out. What doesn't work for me? So there are some consequences, I think, for the decisions that were told here. Let me go with the biggest issue that I have with this movie, and it's by far and away the biggest issue. I feel the movie ends up being a little bit incoherent in regards to its narrative. It's a little bit of a confused story in many ways. You don't quite get taken for a ride. You feel like you're never really quite sure what's actually kind of happening. Now, I feel partly this is because there's two timelines, and where it flicks between the two of them, there are occasions where you're not quite sure which timeline you're actually looking at, and there are quick cuts, and it doesn't transition into the other timeline, I feel, without kind of letting you know as much. It's kind of you sometimes you end up kind of thinking, oh, that's this timeline. And I feel maybe they needed to be more of a transition into the different timelines, and maybe not cutting back and forth quite so quickly. There seems to be events that happen that are just kind of like skimmed over, and you don't really know what has happened or what is kind of going on. I feel the motivations of some people are particularly kind of unclear, and the characterization is lacking, particularly in the modern timeline with Alice Eve. I really didn't feel like we got much in regards to the characterization. I really didn't know the status quo between the couple, Alice Eve and her kind of her husband, who you recognise from Game of Thrones if you're a fan of that. I almost forgot they had a child at one point because he's kind of like he's off screen for a long time, and you kind of forget they're even there. So the editing in this movie, I think, is its biggest downfall here. It's edited so it ends up being a little bit incomprehensible, a little bit incoherent. The movie, I think, also plays a little long. Now, this is, I feel, partially due to it having two timelines, which are two sort of fully developed stories to a certain degree that do sort of dovetail, so to speak. And there are some interesting elements that I do feel are introduced. There's something called a foundation sacrifice, which was a fascinating kind of subject, but it's maybe introduced a little late, and you know, there are things here that I feel didn't make a lot of sense either. But so the movie is around 2 hours, so just over 2 hours. I feel it could have been shorter. But I actually feel like it maybe have been better from having it focused on one timeline. I feel having the two timelines, it made the movie, as I feel very discombobulated, that you couldn't really grasp what was going on in some sequences. It makes kind of broad sense, but like some of the intricacies of it, I found were very kind of like just kind of brushed over. The acting is fine, but I don't think it's anything special. I think the 30s kind of timeline is probably the better one, even though that's less supernatural stuff happening in that one, but it's handled maybe better than for the modern one, which things just seem to happen, characters just seem to do things, and it's really kind of got quite unclear what's actually meant to be kind of going on and why people are doing things and why they are there and things like that. So it's a very lavish movie. It looks great. I mean, this movie is visually, I think, very, very impressive. But it's kind of a case of the story, the narrative is somewhat ignored for the kind of the visuals. And as I mentioned, the director here, you know, he likes doing these kind of like artistic flourishes. But I've got to be honest with you, I think that they're overdone. And I gave you the example with the key going through the latch and things like that. But we see it so often, it gets to the point where it's just a little bit of a gimmick. So these kind of Edgarite-isms, I would best describe it. You know, it happens like way too much. That kind of should have been picked up by a producer, I feel more. And yeah, the editing is just like I said, it needed to have a less kind of frantic pace in the editing. As I understand it, there's plans here to make this a trilogy of films. I don't know what's happened, or if it ended up just being the one film and they've tried to cram it all in here. But yeah, you feel the length a little bit. So what do we think of this movie? How do I rate this movie? Like, I don't think it's a bad movie. I think it's just a very confused movie, and the end product is not the kind of the interesting narrative that it could have been. I think the elements are there, but it's just kind of the final product just seems to be a little bit of a hatchet job, I have to be honest. You know, individual scenes, and like I said, the look of it looks brilliant, but for a narrative, it really is its biggest downfall there. So for me, I can't really say anything more than a 5 out of 10, a bang on kind of, you know, an average movie. There are certain aspects of this movie excels, but it really has a big detriment in its narrative momentum and things like this. 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? Would you see it? Please do let me know, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.